the design process. So we're going to talk about designers and the design process. What is a designer? So a designer is simply somebody who designs a product. So we had designers since the beginning. If you were going to make a hammer, somebody has to design it. So you have to decide how big the hammer should be, what the top should look like, how long it should be, how much weight should it have, what's the shape of it, etc. Every single thing that we build has to be designed. You have fashion designers that design the clothes we wear. We have architects that design the buildings we live in. You have the industrial designers that design, the hammers and all these manufacture tools, etc. So they've been around forever designing physical things. Now, what happened was when we started to get computers, I'm talking about the early computers that only had the text terminal. So again, think about your command line. So you type something into the command line, you get something back from the computer, some text, and then that determines maybe what you're going to type next. So you have this very complicated interaction between you and the computer. So it's like a little conversation going on there. And people, designers looked at it and realized that, well, this needs to be designed. We have to decide, how exactly should it work? What are the kind of things I can say? What can the computer say back to us, etc. How do we keep state? How much state should there be? So how much should the computer remember about what I said before, etc. And so the term interaction design was coined early on at this time to talk about, designing this interaction between a human and a computer. So since then, it's moved on to, any interaction design is the design of any interaction between us and the digital world. HCI, or human computer interaction, is a scientific field, right? So an HCI researcher is a researcher, a person who goes out and does actual experiments on people, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. So, for example, an HCI researcher might ask the question, is it better to have a serif font or a sans serif font in terms of, human understanding of the text? And they can just go and do experiments on people, bring a bunch of people in, have them read something in serif font and a sans serif font, give them tests to figure out how much they learn and, how much they capture, how fast they can read, etc. I'll use eye trackers to figure out what they're looking at. Whatever it is that you need to do to, prove your hypothesis. So HCI is a scientific field, and they study how, people interact with computers and what are the things that work and what things don't work in terms of how to design, all these computer systems. So it's a big field. It covers anything to do with human and computer interaction, which is not just laptops and computers, but it's also robots nowadays, or really any sort of machine. So that's the HCI field. One last thing I want to say about designers is just in the real world, when you go to a company, like a big company like, say, Apple Computer, they'll have whole departments of designers. So a designer is a job title, and big companies will have, big software companies will have like whole departments of people whose job it is just to design their software. The people who actually are hired as designers, a lot of them used to be just developers. So a lot of developers, some developers move into design role, but not all the designers were developers. So some of the designers might come from, say, media arts. So they were artists doing 3D modeling or whatever, and then they moved to learn more about building software and just a little bit about building software and how that works, and got interested in design. So you have those kind of people, and you have people from different fields become designers. So designers do come from different fields, and there are some that in fact do study, get graduate degrees in design. So that's for a big company. As you move down, to medium-sized and smaller companies, they really can't afford to have full-time designer teams. So you also have design firms So these are firms that, again, are all designers, but then consult with these smaller, medium-sized companies when they need some design. So you're a small company, you do have a bunch of programmers, you want to build a new app, so you might consult with a design firm. The design firm, again, goes through the process, which I'll show in a little bit, comes up with a mock-up design for the app, gives that to the developers. Invariably, the mock-ups don't cover everything. Developers still end up having to do a lot of the design, the low-level details of the design in this case. So in those cases, again, it's still very good for developers to know about design. Even if you're just, if you're getting a mock-up from somebody else, you still need to understand what things are important about it, what is not important, and how to extend it to the rest of the app, which is not there. And then, even smaller companies many times can't even afford to hire consultants. So the developers do all the design. So a lot of developers are designers too. So I think, every developer should be at least a competent designer. And you're maybe not going to spend all the time to become a super great designer. But at least you shouldn't be really bad. You should at least be able to come up with something that is decent, B minus. So the process. So let's say going back to, so you're a consulting company, you get hired by a software company to design their new app. What do? Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to research about the client, what their problems are. So let's say you're building a real estate app, so you're going to have to study about what real estate means, what do they want to do, who's the buyers, who are the sellers, how does that all work, what does the business look like, so figure out how the business works. Then looking at your app specifically, figure out who's going to use it and who are the stakeholders. So obviously the users are going to be stakeholders, but there are going to be other people who also going to be stakeholders. So for example, again, you're doing a pizza delivery app. So obviously the people buying pizza are going to use it, but maybe the people that get the data at the other end are also stakeholders, right? They want to get the data about when to deliver, etc., and the tips and all that. Even though they're not the ones using the app, they're still getting impacted by it. So they're going to be stakeholders on that app. So figure out everybody who's going to complain about your app. Those are the stakeholders. And then ask them what are their expectations. What do they expect to get from your app? You can do all these things by using interviews, interviewing the people, questionnaires. If you have if your users is like everybody, you can just send out a bunch of questionnaires and have them answer them, or just observation. You can sit back and see how they're doing things now, and see how you're going to change that and how you're going to improve it. Next in the process, you create personas and user stories. I'm going to talk about those next. Once you have those, then you finally go in and actually design your mock-up. So this is a mock-up. It's just basically a drawing of what the app look like. Various screens, you can have a drawing for each screen or each one of the major screens in your app, showing what they look like. And that is usually the end of the design process for the designers. They're going to give that to the developers. But many times, it's just the first step. So we just kind of iterate. So they give that to the developers. Developers maybe do a little a little proof of concept, give that to users. Users use it, get some feedback back to the designers, and we repeat the loop a couple of times. In the case of web apps, you're always sort of doing the whole process because web apps don't need to be delivered. You can just update your website. So you're constantly, getting feedback from users, and then improving, adding or removing features from your web app. Personas. What is a persona? A persona is just an archetype that describes the various goals and behaviors among your users and customers. So the idea is that all of your users are individuals. They're all different. And what you want to do is just look at all my users there and pick, one user from each group. So you can usually group the users into, types of users of different types. So just pick one from each, or, create one for each one of those. So you want the persona to encapsulate the critical behavior data. So what the critical points about that user that is going to change their behavior as it relates to your app. So yeah, giving them a real name and a real backstory and all this, it really helps us, like as designers, sympathize with the users and build better apps. So for example, if you're building a restaurant app, you might have maybe 4 personas. So you might have a specific student that is looking for cheap food, a mom that is looking for fast and healthy food, so healthy but also delivered quickly. You might have a gourmand that likes fancy food that looks good. He takes pictures of them, of the food, very conscious of that. And you might have a businesswoman who is on the corporate. The company pays for all the meals, so she's not price conscious, but she might have other priorities in terms of the food delivery. So, and these are, just to give you an idea, these are not actual personas. So this is an example persona here. So a persona should have an actual name. So you have to give it a real person name. That's the first thing. So this is Katie Bennett. Has a real photo. So just go to one of those stock photo websites and the free ones, and you can get a stock photo of Katie Bennett right there. And then a couple paragraphs describing Katie. So a first paragraph, you create, this is all fiction. So you create a fictional but detailed background for Katie. So how old is she? Her family status. She's a stay-at-home mom, 3 kids, etc. Her husband has a repair shop. And then a second paragraph again with details, but then now you're going to focus more on her life as it pertains to your app. So in this case, we're building some sort of photo app. And so we're talking about Katie, that she has a big DSLR camera. She likes those expensive cameras. She's into photo as a hobby, and she's also hoping to take photos for the shop's print and web advertisements. So that helps you then build the last thing, which is the goal. This is the persona's goal in terms of using your app. So what does this person hope to get from your app? In this case, she wants to learn how to make her photos of cars and car parts look like those she sees in advertisements. So very specific to her and her life, etc. But you can see how that can be generalized to other people in similar situations. So that's the thing about a persona. It has to be specific, completely fictional, of course, but also something that you can see can be, you can see there be other people very similar to Katie, but obviously not working for a car part. Maybe they have a different kind of business, etc. So why use personas? They're very good for communicating the user needs to each other. So as you talk to each other, this is between your teammates. You can use their names. You can say, okay, Bobby might be confused by that button. So there's something about Bobby's background that means that he might not understand what that button does. You can say Katie does not have time to read all that. So again, something about her background means that she's busy. She doesn't have time to read the whole thing. Bill will like that feature a lot. Same thing. So you can use the personas as shorthands for improving your design. Stop focusing on what you think is best. So a very common problem for first-time designers is that we focus on us. Like, I don't like that. I wouldn't use that. So obviously nobody else would. Well, that's wrong, right? So just because I wouldn't use it doesn't mean 10 million other people would. So having personas, it's a quick reminder. Like, yeah, I wouldn't use it, but Katie definitely would. And then similarly, you can then use that to explain to your client why you put in a feature. And finally, the personas help us because they're specific. They help us remind you that the users are individuals. Each user is going to have different things, and that actually helps us make more robust designs. So we don't have things that can be anger some of the users or be really useless for some specific subset of users. User stories. So a user story is now you're starting to actually build or decide on what features your app should have. So each user story capture a description of one of those features from the user's perspective. So they generally have the form of, as this persona, I want a particular feature so that I can satisfy a particular need. So here's some examples. You can say, well, as Peter, I want a menu so that I can easily get to the music section. Really wants to get to the music section really quickly all the time. So he's going to want that on the top menu right there. Going to want that button so he doesn't have to fiddle through the app, doesn't want to press multiple buttons. As Alice, I want to receive an email whenever someone comments on my post so I can reply to them quickly, right? So Alice wants a subscribe feature, basically. As Rosa, who is a manager in my persona description, I want to view a list of all the comments from the last X days so I can make sure my online store is not being abused. All right, so Rosa, the manager, has a specific need for this specific feature that other users might not have, obviously. So what you want to do is for the milestones, and when you're starting out, is you start out with the user stories that cover the main features. So your app should have a core functionality for for example, any social app. The core functionality is posting messages and reading other people's messages. That's basically that's the core of what they do. Is each user can post a message and other people can read that message. So you have two features there that are the core. So you should definitely have those as your first user stories if that's the kind of app you're building. So you start with the core functionality, the main things that drive the most important features, write those user stories, and then you start going down and thinking of all the other cases where your personas might have different user stories, right? So a particular persona might have one story, user story that doesn't apply to other personas. That's where when you're getting into subset of your market, and that's fine. You're gonna want some of that, but yeah, you don't want to get too deep. Definitely not when you're starting. You start at the top and then work your way to the details. Like I said, the goal is for each feature in your app to exist because it brings value to somebody. So if you have a user story, that means that that person needs that feature, and why. So everything in your app should be adding value to your users, and so that's one of the reasons we like them. And then, of course, we can use them to identify the most valuable features. So this comes in handy when time runs out and you realize you cannot implement all the features. So you decide we're going to implement the most important features.